Please join us in a spirit of meditation, reflection, or prayer as we deepen into our service and share our opening words from the environmental activist and Buddhist scholar, Joanna Macy. We are capable of suffering with our world, and that is the true meaning of compassion. It enables us to recognize our profound interconnectedness with all beings. Don't ever apologize for crying for the trees burning in the Amazon or over the waters polluted from mines in the Rockies. Don't apologize for the sorrow, grief, and rage you feel. It is a measure of your humanity and your maturity. It is a measure of your open heart. And as your heart breaks open, there will be room for the world to heal. That is what is happening as we see people honestly confronting the sorrows of our time. May we make room in our hearts and in this shared space for the world to heal. Some Unitarian Universalists have a practice of the empty chair. This chair symbolizes for the people who are in our hearts, but who cannot be physically present in the room due to absence or death, or in this virtual time, a lack of technology. Today, the empty chair is for the animal species who have become extinct and are no longer physically in the world. We join Unitarian and Unitarian Universalists all over the world in lighting our chalice. We are in good company. If you have your chalice with you, I invite you to turn on your video to share while we light them. We will continue this ritual to help bind us together while we are physically apart. So I encourage you to find a candle for Sundays if you haven't already. You may light your chalices now. Let's try leaving our videos on until I have finished our chalice lighting words. Our chalice lighting this morning comes from Robin Wall Kimmerer. We will explore some of her writings in our Curiosity Guild this fall. In the Western tradition, there is a recognized hierarchy of beings, with, of course, the human being on top, the pinnacle of evolution, the darling of creation, and the plants at the bottom. But in native ways of knowing, human people are often referred to as the younger brothers of creation. We see that humans have the least experience with how to live and thus the most to learn. We must look to our teachers among the other species for guidance. Their wisdom is apparent in the way that they live. They teach us by example. They've been on the earth far longer than we have been and have had time to figure things out. We light our chalice this morning for the flame of truth and wisdom.
This morning, we're going to talk about climate change. And I didn't want to chop this sermon up with tons of attribution, but I don't walk around with a lot of statistics and deep climate science in my head. So I'm relying heavily on the expertise of others and quoting often. I'm happy to provide you with my sources if you want to read more. For some, this will be new information, and for some it will be review. But I would like us to have a common foundation when we discuss climate in this congregation. So many factors contribute to climate change, but the most concerning is greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases are gases that absorb infrared radiation and then send the radiation out again. And I'm sure a scientist would correct me, but I just think of radiation in this instance as heat, radiation heat. Some of the radiation goes up and some is directed back toward the Earth. The Earth receives radiation from gases in the atmosphere and from the sun. And we get a break from solar radiation at night, but we are bathed in atmospheric radiation 24/7. If we did not have this atmospheric radiation, the average temperature on Earth would be 0 degrees Fahrenheit, as opposed to the 59 degrees we currently have. And that is why they call them greenhouse gases. They prevent all of our heat from escaping into space, just as a greenhouse holds in the warmth. So when these gases are working right, they make life on Earth possible. And this elegant system has worked right for a very, very long time. There are around 40 greenhouse gases. By far, the most common is H2O, or hydrogen dioxide, or water vapor. And water vapor is primarily natural in origin. Water is constantly exchanged between the atmosphere and the Earth's surface through evaporation and precipitation. This process is so rapid that on average, a molecule of water resides in the atmosphere for only 2 weeks. Other greenhouse gases, however, have much longer lifespans, some up to hundreds of years. And this is important. These gases are already in the atmosphere. Even if humans stop pumping greenhouse gases in the air today, full stop, what is already there will remain there for a long time. The damage is already done. So here is a list of the top 4 offenders. Carbon dioxide. One of the most important greenhouse gases of human origin is carbon dioxide, which is released by the combustion of fossil fuels, meaning burning oil and coal and biomass. As of 2010, the most recent figure I could find, CO2 made up 65% of all human-made greenhouse gas emissions. So that's quantity-wise the biggest offender. Over half of the CO2 comes from transportation and electricity production. And between 65% and 80% of CO2 released into the air dissolves into the ocean over a period of 20 to 200 years. The rest is removed by slower processes that take up to several hundreds of thousands of years, including chemical weathering and rock formation. This means that once in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide can continue to affect the climate for thousands of years. Methane is the next one. The atmospheric concentration of methane is much weaker than CO2, and its lifespan is relatively short, about 10 to 12 years. But it is very efficient at absorbing radiation. It's produced mainly by agricultural industries and the production and distribution of gas and oil. But a considerable amount also comes from natural sources. Its concentration rose significantly between 1990 and today. Nitrous oxide, the third most significant greenhouse gas released into the atmosphere. Nitrous oxide has 310 times the global warming potential of CO2 and is emitted from agricultural activities, the burning of biomass, and through the production of various chemicals such as nitric acid. Halocarbons are the last ones. Halocarbons are man-made chemical compounds that contain carbon and elements from the halogen family, which is like bromine, chlorine, and fluorine. Although much less abundant than CO2, they are powerful greenhouse gases because their global warming potential is incredibly high, 1,300 to 24,000 times higher for fluorine compounds compared to CO2. And they have a very long lifespan. These gases are used in refrigeration systems, aerosols, insulation materials, and the electrical industry. Some of these substances, CFCs, were implicated in the destruction of the ozone layer in the 1980s. After the adoption of the Montreal Protocol in 1987, their emission levels have gone down significantly. So I hope you noticed that human activity increases these 4 gases in our atmosphere. I overheard a conversation in Bismarck about how climate change was not a problem here because this is a rural state. Well, A, the climate does not recognize state boundaries, and B, you might have noticed agriculture and oil consumption and production were mentioned several times as sources of greenhouse gases. North Dakota then is affected and implicated in climate change. Human activities matter. Many scientists argue that we are in a new geological age brought on by human activity and have dubbed this age the Anthropocene. There's been pushback because not all humans caused this. Primarily, it was those of us in the global north, the heavily industrialized nations. I've also heard it called the capital scene after capitalism, but that's really hard to say, so I'm guessing that won't catch on. So simply put, humans have pumped more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which is raising the temperature of the Earth. And those gases are not going anywhere anytime soon. We are talking about a very small rise in temperature, so far about 1 degree Celsius. This 1 degree and climbing, however, matters a great deal to life on Earth. Let's talk about what we're seeing and expect to see more of with this warming. One of the biggest impacts is rising sea levels. Oceans absorb about 90% of the heat from greenhouse gases. In 2018, a new record was set for ocean heating. As a result, sea levels have swelled over 8 inches since 1880, with about 3 of these inches gained in the last 25 years. Rising sea levels happen in 3 ways. First, when water heats up, it expands. The water simply takes up more space. Second, glaciers are melting because of warming and because there is less snowfall due to shifting seasons. And third, the massive ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica are melting. Greenland has been in the news this month. Scientists are reporting a record 586 billion tons of ice melted in 2019. When sea levels rise as rapidly as they have been, even a small increase can have devastating effects on coastal habitats. Farther inland, it can cause destructive erosion, wetland flooding, aquifer and agricultural soil contamination with salt, meaning your source of drinking water becomes salty, and loss of habitat for fish, birds, and plants. Higher sea levels are coinciding with more dangerous hurricanes and typhoons that move more slowly and drop more rain, contributing to powerful storm surges that can strip away everything in their path. A storm surge is simply the ocean level rising somewhere due to the storm. And that too has been in the news this week. One study found that between 1963 and 2012, almost half of all deaths from Atlantic hurricanes were caused by storm surges. Already, flooding in low-lying coastal areas is forcing people to migrate to higher ground, and millions more are vulnerable from flood risk and other climate change effects. These effects hit marginalized people and poorer populations disproportionately. Surprise, surprise. The prospect of higher coastal water levels also threatens basic services such as internet access, since much of the underlying communications infrastructure lies in the path of rising seas. Coastal cities and island nations are especially vulnerable. It is projected the ocean will rise another 1 to 4 feet by 2100, which is 80 years from now. So this could be in the lifetime of our RE children. Bismarck is likely to see far more than 25 refugees a year as climate displaces more people. Ocean acidification is another effect of climate change. The greater concentration of dissolved CO2 in the ocean water makes oceans more acidic. And because of this, certain mollusks, corals, and plankton are less able to build and maintain their shells, which in turn affects entire marine ecosystems. Another effect of climate change is the distribution of rainfall. When climate warms, rainfall becomes increasingly concentrated, which means it will rain substantially harder, but that the frequency of rainstorms will decline. Areas that are wet will be wetter, and arid regions will be drier. And I think your imagination can fill in what this will mean for food production and flooding. The Arctic is expected to become ice-free by the middle of this century. This severely impacts the animals that evolved to live in the frozen north and the indigenous peoples who depend on those animals for survival. The permafrost is melting, which means everything built on the permafrost is sinking. Effects of climate change we are already familiar with are floods and droughts, which contribute to epic wildfires. It's been a smoky week here. Imagine what it's like in California. These floods and fires will continue to happen with perhaps greater severity and frequency. Again, the news this week bears that out. And finally, I want to hold up the animals. They are some of the first casualties in our climate crisis. Birds and insects are disappearing at an alarming rate. When seasons shift, migration and pollinating are impacted. Animals adapted to live in particular environments are already in trouble. Think of the starving polar bear. We could talk about the impact of our action on animals, and plants for that matter, all day long. And it kills me a little every day to think about all the species we are pulling down with us. One of my favorite animals is the pika, and these tiny mammals live in isolated rocky areas at high altitude, and they're well adapted to cold alpine climates. They probably will not survive global warming because, unlike many wildlife species that are shifting their ranges north or to higher altitudes in response to changing climate, pikas have nowhere else to go. When I'm hiking and I don't hear their whistles, I start to panic. Are they gone? I spend part of every summer sitting with the pikas and grieving. And of course, I drove to get to the trailhead. So that is a quick and dirty and very incomplete overview of climate change. I think one of the main takeaways is that it is not coming. It is not something we can avert. It's not something that we can fix anymore. It's here and we're in it. Those gases are in our atmosphere and will remain there warming the planet for a long time to come. What remains for us is to address how bad it's going to get. Global warming is here to stay, but it can get even warmer if we continue to pump greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The scientific community keeps putting out goals and we keep blowing by them. One rallying cry is keep it in the ground, meaning we should not be extracting fossil fuels from the earth and burning them to release more greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. North Dakota is ripe for mitigation. The state government has approved almost doubling the flow of oil through the Dakota Access Pipeline. We can hope that recent legal battles brought by the people of Standing Rock will halt that. When I first wrote this sermon, I said the Balkan oil fields were going strong, and this has changed somewhat with the pandemic. But however much oil is being pumped, this is a sticky wicket. Members of this congregation, in the past or still, have an income from oil, either through their jobs or their investments. Likely, a lot of us have invested in fossil fuels in our retirement funds. Oil is a huge part of North Dakota's economy. People, quite understandably, feel angry and threatened when you tell them the way they make a living, the way they stay alive and keep their children alive, has got to go. And all of us use and benefit from the gases we are emitting. We are all part of this system. And, quite literally, life on Earth hangs in the balance. So what are we going to do about that? How can the people of North Dakota live now without making it impossible for their children to live later? Another thing happening in our fair state is the fight over refugees, accepting refugees. If North Dakota remains habitable, this fight is only going to ramp up. Climate refugees will be on the rise in coming years. If we are lucky, we will have to negotiate how we incorporate these refugees. If we're not so lucky, the climate here will change enough that we will become those refugees. We were already doubling down on us and them, afraid to share what we had in an abundant time. What will this look like as the climate continues to change and economies fail? I believe our faith dictates that we will sink or swim together, that we are all in the same boat, planet Earth. Because if we are part of an interconnected web, there is no stranger, there is no them, there's only us. How can this faith community help Bismarck to develop a sense of unity and compassion? How can we help this community see that we will not survive as individuals, but only if we pull together? That's an uphill battle right now. So here is what I think we can do now, and I'm sure there are many more ideas out there. First, we can all be more mindful about our personal habits. When I first wrote this, I was really bothered that the UUA wanted me to fly to Rhode Island for General Assembly, Texas for an interim ministers gathering, Boston for a ministers conference, and Illinois for our regional assembly. Flying is not good for the environment. But all of these things became virtual with the advent of the pandemic, which is showing us that we can do things differently. We see that this pause in our traveling habits is doing what this pause in our traveling habits is doing for the air that we breathe. Going forward, we can continue to be mindful of our driving and travel habits, buy used clothing, because clothing manufacturing is about equivalent to aviation for the amount of gases released into the atmosphere. We can also reduce consumption and recycle. But like racism, the environment is a systemic problem and will require a systemic response. Our individual actions are important, but not sufficient. There is still a lot of effort to find a technical fix, some way to scrub the atmosphere so we can go right on with our overpopulation and our overconsumption. What is actually needed is an adaptive change, a change in us, a change in our culture, a change in our lifestyles, in how we think and what we value. The Green New Deal is a stab at this, and different Indigenous peoples are articulating a different way to be. And this pandemic is helping us to imagine that there might be other ways of living. So there's a lot of good thinking out there. We need to put pressure on our government and corporations to stop the emission of greenhouse gases. And we need to do this yesterday. The current administration has responded by wholesale destruction of regulations aimed at decreasing pollution, opening up the Arctic for drilling, and by withdrawing from international efforts. When I say I'm not sure we can survive 4 more years of this, I'm not speaking metaphorically. I'm being quite literal. We also can't wait for our government and have to be as creative as possible. In North Dakota, we also need to think about the people who make their living in destructive ways. How can we help them to transition to a right livelihood and not hang them out to dry? Another thing we can work on in North Dakota is eradicating the island mentality. We do not actually have an ethical right to turn people in need from our door. How can we shift our culture to one of inclusion and welcome? I think we can start by expanding our own circle. Many Indigenous groups are already hard at work on climate issues. How can we plug in? Additionally, how can we begin to build relationships with other progressive faiths and nonprofits in this town? I think there are more caring, progressive people in Bismarck than we think. And maybe our voices could carry the day if we were to build a mighty coalition. Then perhaps people of goodwill, people who operate from love and compassion and inclusion, would make the laws and policies here and would define the cultural norms. Another thing people in the dominant culture can do in North Dakota is to be good partners to marginalized people. Marginalized people will, of course, bear the brunt of climate change. They already do. This means we look deep within and get very familiar with our own cultural biases and learn to manage them so that we can be trustworthy partners. And then it means shouldering some of the risks and burdens and being steadfast. A fourth thing we can do is to be there for one another. We are living in unprecedented times, and life on Earth is in trouble. Our faith teaches us that we are part of an interdependent web, and that reality is pretty clear right now. We really need each other. As you learn about and accept climate change, an existential crisis is pretty much guaranteed. It surely helps to have company in this and to not feel so alone. I remember hearing about one man who had this figured out way ahead of the curve. He sought help in dealing with what he knew through therapy, and the therapist diagnosed him with delusions. I hope he finds more support now. I think our Social Justice Council will be wrestling with these issues more and more in the future. And it's my hope that that group will not be composed of 5 hardy individuals, but encompass this whole congregation. Learning about climate change is overwhelming. There is not a lot of good news. It is so enormous in its implications that I think we shy away even from thinking about it. I wonder today our attendance is a little lower than it has been this summer, and I wonder if the topic put people off. But if we can't turn and face the truth, things are only going to get so much worse. This is where the spiritual rubber meets the road. This is why cultivating your own spiritual practice and joining with your religious community is so important. We are going to need our grounding values, our relationships, and everything that gives us strength. It is so good that we have one another, and I am so grateful for all of you. Wendell Berry is an American novelist, poet, essayist, environmental activist, cultural critic, and farmer. We learned more about him earlier this summer, and I extinguish our chalices with his poem that many of us might know already and love. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free.
Anyone with eyes to see, anyone with ears to